Now the phenomenologists Husserl and Heidegger redefined reality itself, and the reason they were doing that, there were two reasons. They were concerned that the divide between object and subject that had been set up as a consequence of the scientific and Enlightenment revolution prioritized the objective and left the subjective in a, what would you say, in an abyss of uncertainty and meaninglessness, in part because it was defined away. The subjective became epiphenomenological on a more fundamental reality. Now, that's an existential problem because we can't live in a universe that's devoid of all meaning but suffering, let's say. And it's perverse because there's no perception without a subjective observer. And if you contemplate the situation scientifically, even, let's say, the basic sense data that the empiricists believe that the world is made of is dependent for its existence on perception. And perception is dependent on action, and action is dependent on goal, and goal is dependent on value. And so the notion that there's some objective substrate of existence in the absence of a perceiver who's embedded in a world of value and meaning is not tenable, even from the scientific perspective, partly because we know that perception is action predicated. Now, the phenomenologists tried to solve that subject-object divide problem, and the nihilism or valuelessness that emerges in the scientific worldview by prioritizing not objective reality but experience as such. So you're sitting in this lecture theater, you have a focus of attention, that's why it's a theater. It's built to hint to you when you make your entrance how you're supposed to conduct yourself. The chairs are all facing in a particular direction, they converge on a point. The point is the point of the lecture, the point is the point of your attention, the point is the goal of your attention, right? That all organizes your perceptions. It foregrounds some things, at least in principle, when you're not thinking or distracted, what I'm saying or the slides that I'm using, and that renders everything else increasingly irrelevant as it diverges from the central point. And so there's a foreground. Generally, when you're interacting with someone, the foreground of your attention is their face, and even more specifically their eyes, and even more specifically their pupils. And you do that so you can see what they're pointing to, because you can tell what they're interested in, you can tell what they're compelled by, you can read emotions through the eyes. Our eyes are adapted. Evolution has adapted our eyes to make them maximally visible, colored black against a white background, so that when we interact with people, we can see what their point is. Having seen their point, we can inhabit their frame of reference, we can infer what's meaningful to them, we can adopt their emotions, we can mimic those emotions on our own body, and that's how we understand them. Our face is a value display system, right? And when you're concentrating on someone, you almost always look at their eyes. We're very, very good at that. Even from a distance, you can detect small deviations in someone's eye gaze direction, because understanding the object of their intention and attention is the most important thing you can derive. You're focused here on what I'm saying, you're watching my face, you're watching my eyes, the world constructs itself around that. Husserl's fundamental point was that all perception is intentional. It's associated with a goal. It moves towards a point, and that point is related to the insistence that I put forward at the beginning, that our perception is action-oriented, that our problem is navigation. How do we get from point A to point B, from what is currently to what should be? We're always somewhere moving somewhere else. And then there's a gradient, which is why in this diagram there's a slant upward. What's the gradient? Well, if you're aiming up, the gradient is upward, the gradient is uphill, the gradient is from a lesser place to a greater place. Why would you move from what is to what should be if the place you're headed to wasn't better than the place you're at, assuming that you're not engaged in some form of counterproductive self-destruction? So there's a value gradient in perception itself that sets up the landscape for emotion, right? If you're moving from point A to point B, the value of the movement is the distance between the 2 points in relationship to upward aim. Now, the longer the distance, the harder the journey. So that's an energy expenditure problem. You want to foreground a goal that's valuable in relationship to where you are, that doesn't require more energy than you have at hand. Now you can sequence goals, and we'll get to that. Okay, what's this frame? It's a cybernetic frame. So cybernetic pioneers and many of the developers of computational systems, especially the robotics engineers who started to understand that you couldn't do robotics computation without embodiment. The phenomenologists, the psychologists of perception have all converged on a notion that we inhabit a frame of perception that organizes the world around us, that has a goal in mind. The last thing you need to know about that to begin with is that's a story. That's a story. So the postmodernists insisted that we inhabit a story. They dispensed with the notion that there was a central unifying story that was common to all places and all times, let's say, but they insisted, and correctly so, that even the scientific enterprise is nested inside a story. What's the scientific story? We're making things better. Otherwise, it's an evil scientist story, and there's plenty of them too. And we might say that the true science is the science that serves what? Mankind, the good of mankind, and it's an upward journey, and that's not built into the scientific enterprise itself. It's the a priori frame that the scientist has to inhabit so that they aren't a threat, right? That's the case, you could say, for everything that you do. If any of your actions are predicated on an ultimately downward aim, then you're an agent of chaos, right? At minimum. A story. What's a story? A story is a description of a frame of perception. Now, think about this when you go to a movie. Think about what you're doing. So you see a sequence of subplots, and in the subplots you see the characters in motion. You see them directing their attention. You infer their goals from their speech and their patterns of action. You put that together as a pastiche across multiple instances, and you draw your conclusions about the aim and direction of the character. Having done that, you can adopt that frame. Having adopted the frame, you see the world through the perspective of the protagonist, and you experience his or her emotions, right? You do that to experiment with a frame of perception with no risk, right? Some emotional risk. There's enough enthusiastic impetus in the imitation so that even if you're watching a horror movie that would expose you to phenomena that normally would be aversive, placing yourself in the fictional frame and experimenting with the exposure is sufficiently motivating in the positive direction so that you'll pay for the privilege, right? Why is fiction so important? Why are we so compelled by stories? Because a story is a description of the manner in which we frame our perception, our attention, and our action. So there's a viewpoint that makes the story not secondary, not laid upon another more fundamental reality, but a priori. Now, there's obviously an interplay that has to occur between our understanding of how the world is constituted and how we should act in it. But the notion that there's a simple primacy of material being seems at minimum seems half true and rife with conceptual